When you start with nothing, you learn that power comes not from what you have, but from what you build.
In the vast, icy expanse of Antarctica lived a small penguin named Pip. Unlike the other penguins who were bustling, boisterous, and always jostling for the best fish, Pip was quiet and observant. He wasn't the strongest swimmer or the fastest waddler, but he had a heart as big as the frozen continent itself. One day, a fierce blizzard descended upon the colony, lasting for weeks. The sea churned violently, making it nearly impossible to fish. The penguins grew hungry and anxious, their once lively colony now muted with worry. In the heart of the frozen Antarctic, where the wind screams like a choir of ghosts, Silas stood alone on a jagged shelf of ice, known as the Great White Silence. He was a small creature in a vast and indifferent world, and between his trembling flippers he held a single silver sardine. This was not just a meal. It was his last spark of life, and his only shield against the creeping numbness of the winter. For weeks, the schools of fish had vanished into the deep, unreachable currents, leaving the colony, hollow-eyed and desperate. Silas looked at the fish and felt the sharp, agonizing bite of hunger, but as he prepared to eat, he saw an elder named Barnaby leaning against a wall of snow. Barnaby was a veteran of 1,000 storms, but his feathers were now tattered, and his breathing came in shallow, ragged gasps. He did not beg because he had no strength left to ask for anything, but his eyes held a quiet acceptance of the end. Silas felt a war erupting inside his mind. Logi told him that if he gave away this fish, he would surely perish, and 2 deaths were worse than 1. Reason suggested that he should eat to gain the strength to hunt again later. Yet, as he looked at the elder, Silas realized that surviving as a creature who would watch a friend wither was a fate colder than the ice itself. In an act of radical defiance against his own fear, Silas slid the frozen fish across the slick surface. Barnaby ate with a slow, shaking intensity, and for a moment, the light returned to the old bird's eyes. Silas stood empty-handed and hollow-bellied, facing the biting gale with nothing left to lose. It was in this moment of total scarcity that something shifted within him. Because he no longer had a safety net to cling to, he found a desperate and terrifying courage. He marched toward the edge of the midnight trench, a place of high pressure and dark shadows that the rest of the colony feared to enter. Without the weight of his last possession, he dove deeper than he had ever dared. He pushed through the crushing black water, not because he wanted a snack, but because he had already surrendered to the possibility of his own end. That lack of fear gave him a strength he never knew he possessed. In the crushing depths, he discovered a warm water pocket swirling with thousands of silverfish trapped by the shifting ice. Silas did not just find a meal for himself, he found a way to save every soul in the Great White Silence. He returned to the surface as a leader, not because he was the strongest, but because he was the only one brave, enough to become nothing so that he could eventually become everything. By giving away his only fish, he had broken the chains of his own fear and discovered that when you had nothing left to lose, you finally have the freedom to find greatness. As the colony feasted, and the immediate shadow of starvation lifted, Silas found that his act of radical generosity had changed the very air of the Great White Silence. He was no longer just a survivor. He was a symbol of a new way of living. But with this new status came a burden he had never anticipated. The other penguins began to look at him not as a peer, but as a provider, expecting him to always know where the hidden pockets of fish remained. Silas felt a different kind of cold settling in his chest, the cold of expectation. One evening, as the aurora borealis danced in ribbons of neon green across the sky, a young penguin named Kale approached him with a broken wing and an empty belly. Kale had tried to mimic Silas by diving into the midnight trench, but he had lacked the experience and the desperation that had fueled Silas. He had returned, battered and defeated. Silas looked at the young bird and realized that his story had unintentionally taught others that reckless risk was the only path to glory. He saw the danger in his own legend. He realized that if he did not teach them the wisdom behind the sacrifice, the colony would destroy itself trying to be heroes. Silas decided to lead Kale not to the edge of the trench, but to a shallow tide pool far from the chaos. He showed the young bird how to watch the movement of the kelp and how to listen to the vibration of the ice. He taught him that while giving away your last fish is a leap of faith, keeping the strength to teach others is a long-term vow. The true challenge was no longer surviving the winter, it was surviving the fame of his own sacrifice. Silas understood that a leader is not someone who simply feeds the hungry, but someone who creates a world where no one has to be hungry alone. He began to organize the colony into teams, where the strong protected the weak, and the experienced guided the brave. The midnight trench became a source of life rather than a graveyard of ambition. Years later, when the ice began to melt and the great white silence turned into a roaring ocean of blue, the story of the penguin who gave away his only fish was still told. But the ending had changed. It was no longer a story about a single fish. It was a story about the day 1,000 birds stopped competing for crumbs and started building a kingdom of silver. Silas stood on a high peak, watching the next generation dive with purpose, and he finally understood that his greatest gift wasn't the sardine he gave to Barnaby, but the realization that when you stop living for yourself, you start living forever in the hearts of those you helped find their own strength. Pip, being smaller, had managed to catch only a single, shimmering silver fish before the storm hit its peak. He treasured it, knowing it might be his only meal for days. He tucked it safely in a small, icy crevice near his nest. As the days wore on, the hunger in the colony became a palpable force. He saw the tired eyes of the elders and heard the faint cries of the hungry chicks. One afternoon, Pip noticed a mother penguin, Alara, huddled over her 2 tiny chicks. They were shivering, not just from the cold, but from sheer weakness. Alara looked gaunt, her feathers ruffled with exhaustion. She had been trying to fish every day, but returned with an empty beak each time, her energy draining with every failed attempt. Her chicks were too weak to even cry out anymore. Pip looked at Alara and her family, and then he looked at his single, precious fish. He knew what he had to do. His own stomach rumbled with emptiness, but the sight of the suffering family was a pain far greater. He carefully retrieved the silver fish from its hiding spot. Waddling over to Alara's nest, he gently nudged the fish towards her with his beak. Alara looked up, her eyes wide with disbelief. She saw the fish, then looked at Pip, a small penguin offering his only sustenance. She tried to refuse, nudging it back, but Pip was insistent. He pushed it firmly towards the chicks. With a look of profound gratitude, Alara finally accepted. She tore the fish into small pieces and fed her starving chicks. For the first time in days, a flicker of life returned to their eyes. The storm eventually passed. The sea calmed, and the sun cast a brilliant light over the snow. The penguins, though weakened, surged back to the sea, their spirits lifted. Pip, feeling faint from hunger, was among the last to head towards the water. But as he reached the edge of the ice, something incredible happened. The other penguins, who had witnessed his act of selflessness, formed 2 lines, creating a clear path for him to the sea. They dipped their heads in a gesture of respect. Alara, now looking stronger, stood at the front with her chicks, who chirped happily at the sight of him. This was a tribute Pip had never imagined. The colony's best fishermen then dove into the water and returned, not for themselves, but for Pip. They laid a pile of the day's best catches at his feet, more fish than he could possibly eat. From that day forward, Pip was never just a small, quiet penguin again. He was Pip, the great-hearted. He didn't have the strongest flippers or the loudest squawk, but he had shown everyone that true greatness isn't measured by what you have, but by what you are willing to give. His story became a legend in the colony, passed down from one generation to the next. It was a simple tale of a small penguin and a single fish, but it taught a timeless lesson that in the coldest of places, the warmest hearts shine the brightest. Pip never went hungry again, not because he became a better fisherman, but because he was surrounded by a community that had learned the true value of kindness from his simple, profound act. He had given away his last fish, and in return he had gained the love and respect of his entire world, proving that a single act of generosity can ripple outwards, creating waves of warmth that can thaw even the most frozen of hearts. The legend of Pip reminds us that you don't need to be the biggest or the strongest to make a huge impact. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is share what you have, no matter how small it seems. The world is full of opportunities to be like Pip. A small gesture, a kind word, or a moment of support can change someone's day, or even their life. The greatest treasures we possess are not things we keep for ourselves, but the kindness we give to others. So let's all try to find the Pip within us. Thank you so much for watching and sharing this story with me. If it touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe for more stories that inspire. Stay kind, and we'll see you in the next one. The seasons bled into decades, and the ice that once seemed eternal began to groan and shift under the weight of a changing world. Silas was no longer the swift diver of the midnight trench. His feathers were grizzled with the frost of countless winters, and his movements were slow and deliberate. He spent his days perched on the highest ridge of the Silver Coast, watching the colony he had transformed. The legacy of his single act of sacrifice had become the bedrock of their society. No penguin ate until the elders and the chicks were full, and no diver went into the deep alone. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold, Silas felt the familiar creeping numbness in his limbs that no amount of huddling could warm. He knew his time was drawing to a close. As he sat in the gathering dusk, a young chick waddled up to him carrying a small glistening shrimp, the first catch of its life. The chick offered it to Silas, with wide, trusting eyes, mimicking the stories it had heard since the day it hatched. Silas looked at the offering and then at the circle of strong, healthy penguins surrounding him. He realized that the circle was complete. He had started with nothing and given it away, and in return, he had gained an entire civilization that understood the value of a soul over the value of a meal. He gently nudged the shrimp back toward the chick with his beak, whispering that the greatest meal is the one that fuels a future he would not see. Silas closed his eyes as the great white silence finally lived up to its name, becoming a peaceful blanket of stars and snow. He did not die a martyr or a king. He died as a part of the very ice he had once feared. His body returned to the ocean he had conquered, but his spirit remained in the rhythm of every flipper hitting the water and every silverfish shared in the dark. The penguin, who once had nothing, left the world with everything, because he had taught an entire race that the only thing you truly keep is the thing you give away to someone else. The story of Silas ended not with a whimper of defeat, but with a thunderous splash of 1,000 birds diving into the deep, fearless and united, forever changed by a single frozen fish. Even after Silas was gone, the story did not freeze in the ice of the past. It breathed through every blizzard that struck the Silver Coast and every long night that seemed like it would never end. The colony had grown so large and so wise that they no longer feared the lean years, because they had learned the secret of the silver fish, which was that the strength of the many is the only true shield for the one. A new era arrived where the ice began to crack in ways the elders had never seen, and the traditional hunting grounds shifted beyond the reach of the old maps. A young and headstrong penguin named Orion, who had grown up on the legends of Silas, began to question if the old ways of sharing were holding them back from migrating to richer lands. Orion argued that they should abandon the weak and the slow to race toward the open sea, where the fish were plentiful. He believed that the story of Silas was a fairy tale for a simpler time, and that in this new world only the fast deserved to eat. The colony stood at a crossroads of spirit and survival. Just as the tension reached its peak, a massive shelf of ice collapsed, trapping a dozen of the swiftest hunters, including Orion, in a jagged prison of crystal and deep blue shadows. They were cut off from the sea, and the air was thinning. It was then that the elders remembered the true lesson, not of the fish, but of the reach. They did not leave the trapped hunters to their fate, as Orion had suggested they do to others. Instead, the entire colony, from the smallest chick to the oldest bird, began to chip away at the ice, using their bodies to provide warmth and their collective strength to shift the frozen blocks. They worked for 3 days without rest, driven by the invisible ghost of Silas, guiding their flippers. When the ice finally gave way, and Orion stumbled out shivering and humbled, he looked at the exhausted crowd that had saved him. He realized that if they had followed his logic of every bird for himself, he would have died in that dark hole alone. He saw that the wealth Silas had left behind wasn't a map to a fishing hole, but a map to the heart of their species. Orion knelt in the snow and shared his first meal with the bird who had worked the hardest to free him. The cycle of sacrifice began anew, proving that a legacy is not a monument of stone, but a flame passed from one cold hand to another. The great white silence was silent no more. It echoed with the sound of 1,000 voices looking out for one another, ensuring that no matter how little they had, they would never truly be poor. Silas was gone, but a single fish had multiplied into a sea of hope that would feed them for 1,000 generations to come. The final blizzard of the century eventually swept across the Silver Coast, burying the old landmarks and turning the jagged cliffs into smooth slopes of white. On that day, a young penguin sat at the very edge of the ice, looking out at the endless gray sea, feeling the same hollow ache in his stomach that Silas had felt lifetimes ago. The fish were gone again, and the cold was a physical weight on his shoulders. This young bird had nothing but a small piece of kelp he had scavenged from the shoreline, a bitter and meager prize. As he turned to retreat into the huddle, he saw a chick shivering so violently that its downy feathers were falling away. The young penguin looked at his kelp, then at the vast, indifferent horizon, and finally at the chick. He remembered the name Silas, not as a historical figure, but as a whisper in the wind that told him who he was supposed to be. Without a word, he placed the kelp before the chick and stood tall to block the freezing spray of the ocean. In that moment, the ghost of Silas smiled within the soul of the colony. The story did not end with a death or a feast, but with a simple choice that would be made again and again for eternity. The penguin who had nothing gave anyway, and in that act he became the architect of a world that could never be conquered by hunger or fear. The great white silence was finally filled with the sound of 1,000 hearts beating as one, proving that while a single fish can feed a body for a day, a single act of courage can feed a civilization forever. The ice would melt, the seas would rise, and the stars would shift, but as long as one soul was willing to give its last spark to keep another warm, the legacy of the silverfish would never die. It was the end of Silas's physical journey, but the beginning of an infinite dawn for a people who learned that the only way to truly survive is to ensure that no one is left behind in the cold. Your time is coming. Keep believing. Keep fighting. Don't just watch. Go out and prove them wrong. Thank you for being part of the journey. If you liked it, please like, comment, and subscribe. Bye.